Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History, Episode 71 Toulon, Terror or Treason. In the last episode, we witnessed the violence and upheaval of Toulon. Riddled with divisions, the town's experience of the Revolutionary era was unique, to say the least. Yet, as the Federalist Revolts collapsed around them, Toulon went from the unusual to the unprecedented. Having joined the ill-fated rebellions of the South, Toulon's rebels soon faced a dilemma: terror or treason. Their decision would shape not only the Republic, but the empire that followed. But to get to that empire, or even the end of the Jacobin Republic, Grey History needs your help. I'm putting my all into bringing you a history podcast that isn't black and white, and I need your help to make sure that there's more Grey History waiting for you tomorrow. With bonus content, ad-free listening, and a range of other perks, I need your help to keep Grey History going. So please make a small contribution towards one of your favourite independent shows, and do your part to keep this revolution alive. There's links in the show notes and on the website, and Apple Podcast users also have access to the new Apple subscription option set at the True Revolutionary tier. Now, it's with tremendous pleasure that I get to welcome the newest members of the Grey History community. A warm welcome to the newest virtuous citizens, Britt, Gregory, Latar, and Ironside. Another warm welcome to the newest true revolutionary, Pablo. As always, revolutions need their champions, so a huge thank you to the amazing champions of the people: Cindy, George, Mark, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Joel, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Kevin, Carl, Jeff, Regis, Hannah, Tyrone, Jen, and Cameron. Finally, one gigantic thank you to the gigantically generous heroes of the revolution, the Pantheon of Greats: Brian, Charles, Jeff, Olga, Kevin, Scott, Howard, Fernando, and Gilberto. Once again, thank you to every single member of the community, as this wouldn't be possible without you. Anyway, that's enough from me, so let's get into it. Hopeful. That's how I imagine Toulon's new Jacobin municipality at the start of 1793. The previous years had seen no shortage of challenges. Hunger, unrest, violence, these were the hallmarks of revolutionary Toulon. The prior summer in particular, the so-called horrible quarter, had been particularly gruesome for this harbour of discontent. Yet, despite the bloodshed of recent times, hope would have been a perfectly reasonable feeling. For as a new year dawned for the Republic, the Jacobins had cause to celebrate. Locally, Toulon's Jacobins were triumphant. At the end of 1792, local elections had swept the club's allies into office. Now in control of key positions and institutions, opposition to the Jacobins was almost completely vanquished. The reasons for this were multiple, but in part, Toulon's conservative forces had simply vacated the field. Fearing for their lives after the summer's killings, many anti-Jacobins were unwilling to risk a blade, or perhaps more accurately, a lamppost. Importantly, not only had organised opposition been subdued, but so too had those institutions which presented a potential threat. Although the Jacobins had once championed the meetings of the town's sections, in October 1792, the authorities had brought them to an end. Despite sitting permanently during the turbulent months of the horrible summer, it was subsequently declared that the sections were obstructing municipal affairs. As such, the assemblies were suppressed. Likewise, the naval authorities were a disorderly mess. The naval commandant had of course been lynched in September, and ill discipline, fear, and murdered leadership rendered the arsenal impotent. For all the historic struggles between the town's competing authorities, the military no longer represented a credible threat to the civilian administration. Thus, at a local level, Toulon's Jacobins seemed secure in their triumphant position. Additionally, the local clubbists had wider cause for optimism. Regionally and nationally, Jacobinism was on the rise. As 1793 progressed, both Marseille and Lyon saw the establishment of Jacobin municipalities. Further afield, the Republic's armies were scoring unprecedented success, with the French advancing into Belgium, the Rhineland, and the Western Alps. Surely victory was imminent. Hope, which had been such a scarce commodity of late, may very well have returned in abundance. After all, how could the Jacobins of Toulon not peer into the future and see the peace and prosperity that was so evidently within reach? Alas, it was not to be. Far from tranquility, for Toulon, the future was treason. In the first 6 months of 1793, Toulon's Jacobins found themselves beset by familiar and novel challenges. Over the course of winter and spring, three problems crippled the popularity and supremacy of Town Hall. Firstly, the Jacobins of Toulon soon experienced the same problem facing their counterparts in both Lyon and Marseille. As we've seen previously, despite the lofty promises of Jacobin administrations, local officials found themselves unable to reverse declines in living standards. In fact, things were only getting worse. Inflation, food prices, food scarcity, these were all matters outside of the municipality's control. Nonetheless, hungry citizens held the Jacobins responsible. As each month saw an increase in hardship, so too did it see a reduction in the municipality's support. By spring, the price of bread had doubled since the previous year, while workers detested their payment in the increasingly worthless assignat. Worse still, the entry of England and Spain into the war jeopardized the importation of food. What good was a price maximum on bread if the baker's shelves lay empty? In short, Toulon's Jacobins were in an unenviable position. Having once ridden to power by decrying the ineffectiveness of traditional elites, their replacements found themselves equally helpless. Dockworkers, sailors, and other key constituencies quickly lost patience with their impotent leaders. Trouble was on the horizon. Yet, these problems were just the start. With England and Spain joining the Revolutionary War, Toulon's arsenal became a key military priority. Unfortunately for the French, this priority was in disarray. The tumult of previous years had devastated both the arsenal and the French fleet. Even before the Navy's commandant had been lynched in September, a huge proportion of officers, perhaps as much as 50%, had refused to re-enlist in the Revolutionary Navy. Furthermore, work in the dockyards had become a disorderly affair, wholly unsuitable for a raging war effort. Desperate to reimpose discipline and rehabilitate the shattered navy, the National Convention placed great emphasis on reinvigorating Toulon. Representatives on mission were dispatched to the town, and the Jacobins of the municipality were enlisted to help. The problem, however, was that in reimposing order and revitalizing the arsenal, the municipality was actually undermining its own position. This was the second key problem facing the Jacobins, and the process in which this occurred was multifaceted. Firstly, As discipline was reintroduced to the dockyards, a deliberate effort was made to reduce absenteeism. As such, dock workers and sailors were forced to resign from the National Guard. For the Jacobins in Town Hall, this was a problem. Forced resignations naturally changed the militia's composition. Having once been controlled by the social strata most favourable to the Jacobins, the end result was a guard now dominated by artisans and shopkeepers. Although by no means opposed to the clubbists, in Toulon these cohorts were hardly enthusiastic supporters either. Consequently, the loss of so many advocates within the National Guard was a key blow to Jacobin supremacy. Secondly, as the furnace of industry was relit, thousands of new faces were brought to the town. Workers and sailors poured in as the French had to man, equip, and enlarge the Mediterranean fleet. Naturally, these transplants had no history with the local Jacobins. As such, they had no loyalty either. In fact, Toulon's new residents found themselves importing their own politics, which were, at times, hostile to the cause of the mountain. Thus, although the traditional constituency of the club was expanding, connections to the town's popular classes were weakening by the day. Furthermore, the sudden influx of new workers exacerbated existing shortages in foodstuffs and basic necessities. Finally, in addition to declining living standards and the consequences of a resuscitated arsenal, there was a third factor working against the Jacobins of Toulon: politics. In May 1793, Marseille experienced its municipal revolution. Just 30 miles to the northwest, the affairs of the much larger neighbour naturally impacted Toulon. For the town's disheartened conservatives, Marseille led the way. Perhaps the town's sections could be recalled, and the sectional assemblies could be used as a vehicle to dislodge the Jacobin authorities. Furthermore, with Lyon's sections leading their own municipal revolution just weeks later, the path to power was now tantalizingly clear. As the town grappled with no shortage of challenges, the opponents of the Jacobins began to stir. So it's here, with the Jacobins of Toulon already in a precarious position, that we get to the Federalist Revolts. In short succession, Toulon witnessed anti-Jacobin revolutions in Marseille and Lyon, the purge of the Girondins in Paris, and finally the insurrections and protestations of departments around the country. With foreign forces to the east and south, and insurrectionary rebels to the west and north, what was Toulon to do? Furthermore, how was it that a town currently controlled by Jacobins ultimately fell into British hands? Well, to start us off, let's pick up on that last point: a town currently controlled by Jacobins. This is a departure from the norm. In every other revolt we've explored, Caen, Marseille, Lyon, a Jacobin administration was not in power at the time of the Girondins' proscription. In fact, for both Marseille and Lyon, their municipal revolutions meant that local authorities were explicitly anti-Jacobin. But here, in Toulon, we still have a municipality associated with the mountain, which means that there is a very obvious question that we should ask. How were the capital's events received in Toulon, and were they the catalyst for another municipal revolution? From the perspective of the Jacobin municipality, the response to the 2nd of June is probably not what you expect. Although the mountain had triumphed in the capital, their local allies were hardly celebrating. In fact, historian Michael Crook paints a picture of a club saddened by the events in Paris. Now, I'm sure that some local Montagnards were a little bit more enthusiastic, but this tepid response actually aligns with many members of the convention itself. Remember, there was no shortage of representatives who were dismayed by the fact that an armed crowd had forcibly compelled the government to expel legitimately elected deputies. This dismay seems to have flowed to Toulon. Here, local Jacobins weren't as radical as some of their neighbouring peers, and the prospect of counter-revolutionary invasion meant that intra-republican divisions were dangerous distractions. In fact, so appalled by the apparent lawlessness of the capital, some local Jacobins even defected to the re-emerging opposition. To be clear, these defections were limited, and the town's authorities remained loyal to the now Montagnard-controlled convention. But the very fact that the town's authorities were experiencing defections in the wake of 2 June was hardly a good omen. Nor, for that matter, were developments in southern France. As we've seen previously, throughout the month of June, the Federalist Revolts escalated rapidly. Departments from across the country called for armed resistance, and nearby Marseille was one of the most vocal. As delegations arrived from as far afield as Bordeaux, fellow citizens implored Toulon to join the insurrection. In the face of what appeared to be a truly national movement, these events naturally emboldened the town's anti-Jacobin opponents. For Town Hall, however, these developments were unwanted, to say the least. Tensions flared between the opposing camps, as demands for the town's sections became increasingly deafening. Escalating the situation further was the presence of many Jacobin refugees from nearby communities. As Marseille, Lyon, and other centres rejected their Jacobin authorities, Toulon had become a lone outpost for supporters of the mountain. Having fled their homes to avoid what they saw as counter-revolution, these exiles lent their support to the increasingly embattled municipality. The sections, they warned, were a Trojan horse. Far from popular sovereignty, they harboured the revolution's demise. Now, in forewarning that the sections were nothing but trouble, the exiled Montagnards were right on the money. However, their advice on how to handle the problem, well, that was a little less sound. On the 12th of July, Toulon's Jacobins held a procession through the streets. Far from calling for unity for the good of the nation, they publicly threatened all proponents of the sections. Just in case marching around with weapons didn't deliver the message clearly enough, the cry, "Death to all sectionaries," underscored their point. Unfortunately for the Montagnards, this intimidation did not have the intended effect. A saddler named Roux immediately took the initiative. A town councillor and an officer in the National Guard, Roux used his status to publicly endorse the reconvening of the sections. With speed, a petition gathered the signature of more than 200 citizens and was promptly submitted to the municipality. Far from waiting for a reply, some sectionaries simply pressed ahead and reassembled anyway. In response to this challenge, the Jacobin municipality was in a precarious position. Increasingly unpopular and isolated, the authorities desperately sought to re-enlist dock workers and sailors into the National Guard. But as dawn approached, it was too little, too late. By the following morning, it appears that the municipality had accepted defeat. Knowing the bloody demise of their peers in Lyon, the Jacobins chose submission, and the sections were formally recalled. Wasting no time, the bodies proclaimed themselves the sovereign authority in Toulon. Thus, on the eve of Bastille Day, 1793, Toulon experienced a much-delayed municipal revolution. As bloodless as Marseille's and as prompt as Lyon's, this change in regime was a rather orderly affair. In fact, some would say too orderly. As with all things French Revolution, it's only a matter of time before someone shouts conspiracy. For Toulon in particular, there is no shortage of contemporaries, and even historians, who place great emphasis on secret schemes when explaining the town's treason. Now, these conspiracies run the gambit. At one end, you have Britain portrayed as an all seeing puppeteer. Apparently limitless in its resources and capabilities, it's alleged that the reactionaries of Toulon had Prime Minister Pitt on speed dial. A more nuanced stance would be one which focuses on the enemy within, highlighting the coordination of those with royalist sympathies. These conspiracies place little emphasis on British leadership and instead focus on the intrigues of disaffected citizens. Finally, at the other end of the spectrum, you of course have historians who see no conspiracy at all. For full disclosure, I generally find myself sitting in the last camp, and I certainly don't think that the British managed to orchestrate Toulon's treason through some carefully planned plot from London. That being said, contemporaries did, so we must keep that perspective in mind as we discuss their lived experience. Furthermore, for those who wish to highlight the maneuverings of royalists within Toulon, well, they do have some interesting observations. So, going forward, I will point out the occasions in which those who claim conspiracy see something sinister. That way, you can reach your own conclusions. In relation to Toulon's sudden municipal revolution, the very fact that the insurrection was so seamless naturally leads to suspicion. Historian Paul Cottard, for example, alleges that these events were carefully planned. According to Cottard, precautions were taken to ensure a peaceful affair. Amongst other actions, this included the interception of the municipality's communications, as well as bribes for Toulon's workers to ensure their inaction. Of course, these allegations of conspiracy are contentious, and some historians passionately refute them. Historian Michael Crook is clear in his belief that the revolution was spontaneous, and points out that the saddler, Roux, was himself a member of the Jacobin-aligned town council. For Crook, this is proof that Roux was merely the latest in a series of high-profile defections, compelled to act after the menacing procession of the clubbists. Unfortunately for us, the siege of Toulon would see the loss of countless records, destroying much of the evidence that would make these debates resolvable. Resurrected from their hibernation on the 13th of July, 1793, the sections of Toulon immediately sprung into action. Following the lead of nearby Marseille, a general committee was promptly staffed, consisting of delegates from each section. Although envisioned as a temporary administration, the sudden deterioration of affairs rendered the committee the dominant institution of insurrectionary Toulon. The French fleet, which was still docked in the harbour, also sent representatives. Many officers were supportive of the Jacobins' demise, and for those who weren't, well, where were they going to go? The British fleet had been spotted just 2 days later on the 15th of July. Any exit from the harbour meant near certain defeat. Now, in order to ensure that I do actually get you to the Siege of Toulon this episode, we're not going to examine the regime of the anti-Jacobins in great detail. But I do want to note 3 ways in which Toulon follows and then simultaneously deviates from the pattern we've seen in other Federalist revolts. Firstly, the Jacobin municipality was dismissed, the Jacobin club was closed, and prominent Montagnards were arrested and tried. In this, Toulon was going no further than either Marseille or Lyon. But in seeking to root out the wicked plots of these traitorous vampires, the extent of Toulon's political repression was unprecedented. More than 40 death sentences were passed in the months that followed, many multiples of those passed by either the previous Jacobin authorities or the anti-Jacobin regime of other insurgent communities. Furthermore, in addition to these executions, hundreds were detained for suspected crimes and loyalties. So overcrowded were the prisons that a warship was transformed into an improvised jail. Thus, the repression unleashed by Toulon's anti-Jacobins was significant, and some historians label these events as a white terror. The terror's victims included former officials, such as the Jacobin mayor. Also included were the civilians accused of leading the gruesome violence which had consumed the town the previous summer. In fact, so zealous were these prosecutions that British authorities would eventually attempt to constrain the courts after their arrival in Toulon. As such, it was with this knowledge that I asked in the last episode if a contemporary Jacobin would still be so flippant regarding the violence of 1792 if he knew the just deserts which awaited his peers. Secondly, in addition to escalating Toulon's already violent experience of the revolutionary era, the anti-Jacobins refused to comply with the orders of the Convention. Declaring themselves in resistance to oppression, decrees from the mutilated Convention were deemed illegitimate. Naturally, this included the new Constitution of 1793. Interestingly, of all the revolts we've examined, this is the only occasion where an insurrection occurred after the Constitution was proclaimed. In this, we have a departure from Caen, Marseille, and Lyon, who were all well down the road of rebellion when confronted with the divisive document. Choosing to emulate the approach of their neighbours, Toulon suppressed the Constitution and refused to follow Lyon's lead in holding deliberations for the proposal's acceptance. Finally, the rebels of Toulon made it clear that this was a patriotic revolt. Great lengths were taken to pledge allegiance to the Republic, and the authorities followed revolutionary rhetoric with tangible action. Amongst other initiatives, Toulon continued to supply French forces on the Italian frontier. The town may have broken with Paris, but it remained with the Republic, one and indivisible. However, despite denouncing as traitors those who would label them as counter-revolutionaries, there were undoubtedly reactionary elements to Toulon's new regime. Going much further than their insurrectionary peers, Toulon's authorities made notable accommodations with the institutions of the past. Perhaps most notably, peace was restored with the Catholic Church. Throughout the insurrection, public worship became common once more, and the authorities made a point of celebrating occasions with the singing of hymns in Toulon's cathedral. One anti-Jacobin official even championed reconciliation between church and state. Delivering a speech, he highlighted the need to come together under the standard of the homeland and religion. In short, Toulon largely stuck to the familiar insurrectionary script. Accentuating some notable aspects of these rebellions, the experience of Toulon was nonetheless comparable to both Marseille and Lyon. So too, for that matter, was the response from Paris. Needless to say, for all the talk of Toulon's republican patriotism, the Jacobins of the Convention were having none of it. Denouncing the rebels as Federalist traitors, compromise was simply unacceptable. As such, the anti-Jacobin regime soon found itself in a corner. By mid-August 1793, the Federalist Revolts were faltering. The Convention's forces were besieging Lyon, while additional troops were marching on Marseille. With Normandy's revolt having already collapsed, it did not take a prophet to see the future. Defeat was a matter of time. But While Toulon's moderates succumbed to the heavy weight of helplessness, the town's royalists sensed opportunity. With sympathisers already in prominent positions throughout Toulon's regime, now was their time to shine. It's here, as Toulon faced the inevitability of defeat and retribution, that we can return to the negotiations of Marseille's rebels and the British fleet. As we've seen previously, in the final days of Marseille's ill-fated rebellion, the city's authorities opened negotiations with the British. Officially, the rebels were seeking a reprieve from the British blockade. Unofficially, they sought protection, not compassion. With the armies of the Republic drawing closer by the day, British intervention was their last chance of salvation. Resolving to contact the enemy, envoys were sent to nearby Toulon. Encouraged to partake in the negotiations, Toulon declined. Not yet willing to break bread with the British, Toulon's authorities remained aloof and instead played for time. As such, Marseille negotiated directly and independently with Vice Admiral Hood. Historians disagree as to what happened next. With negotiations occurring on the Victory, what is clear is that Hood permitted grain to reach Marseille. In return, Marseille offered to embrace the standard of the monarchy. It is also generally believed that Marseille's delegation was the one to suggest that both Marseille and Toulon be entrusted to the British. For those who see conspiracy, the British are usually portrayed as being eager to seize these unbelievable prizes. After all, some depict the British as having orchestrated the opportunity to do so, through secret collaborations with the enemy. But most historians push back on these claims, forcefully arguing that the idea for occupation originated from Marseille's rebels. Furthermore, in a perspective that I found particularly interesting, historian James Holland Rose claims that Hood at first hesitated to accept these surprising proposals. But with such tantalizing spoils up for grabs, why would Hood hesitate? Well, to put it plainly, Hood had no effective means to actually occupy both Marseille and Toulon. Remember, the admiral had a fleet, not an army, while the arrival of the Republic's forces was imminent. Furthermore, cooperation from the French fleet was far from guaranteed, a necessity for any deal to be done. How precisely was a pact to be reached when Hood seemingly lacked the conditions to conclude it and the men to hold it? Thus, while some suspect a carefully planned plot to deliver the ports to the British, most historians see a hastily improvised plan instigated by the desperate insurgents. A plan which may have surprised Hood as much as anyone else. Whatever the case may be, by the 23rd of August, Hood had decided to act. Optimistic to a fault, Hood would roll the dice. Thus, on the 23rd, the Vice Admiral drafted up a proclamation for both Marseille and Toulon. Promising all the assistance he could offer, Hood's terms were simple. Both communities would fly the royal standard, disarm the ships in their harbours, and turn over the fortifications, ports, and vessels. Seeking to reassure nervous patriots, the Vice Admiral made it clear that all of these items, including the French fleet, would be returned at the conclusion of a fair and honourable peace. Already complicit in treason, Marseille's delegation wrote to the authorities of Toulon, still removed from the negotiations. Writing from aboard the Victory, the negotiators praised the generosity and good intentions of the British, impressed upon their fellow rebels that Hood offered a remedy for the nation's ills. This letter, and copies of Hood's proclamations, were promptly dispatched to shore. Unfortunately for Marseille, time was now up. Hood's proclamation was drafted on the 23rd, and Republican armies seized the city on the 25th. As discussed previously, it's also not clear if the city would have willingly entrusted its military installations to the British. At least one section formally rebelled against Marseille's sectional committee, and it's possible that more were ready to follow. But while Marseille was lost, Toulon still had time. Well, if it acted with haste. Confronted with the occupation of neighbouring Marseille, the town faced a choice: terror or treason. As the Girondin deputy Isnard put it, it was necessary either to surrender to the Montagnards or the British fleet, to yield to the tender mercies of Robespierre or to Hood. The decision was far from easy. Royalist opinions echoed in the sections, warning of the misery of surrender and the futility of independent resistance when food was in such short supply. Historians have spilt a ridiculous amount of ink over just how much food Toulon did or did not have, but it is clear that the perception of imminent starvation was used by some to encourage a deal with the British. Yet, despite the dangers of a triumphant convention, opposition to treason was understandably forthcoming. Contemporaries wrote of violent debates as passionate voices argued for their preferred approach. The tipping point in favour of treachery is contentious. One resident recorded that it was the anti-Jacobins from Marseille, fleeing with fresh stories of Jacobin atrocities, which swung opinion in favour of British protection. Historian Paul Cottard alleges that those who attempted to stop the treason were also intimidated and even thrown into prison, including moderates who had once supported the anti-Jacobin regime. In fact, Cottard argues that the opposition was so intense that this is part of the reason why the authorities would embrace such a severe political repression throughout Toulon's so-called White Terror. Whatever the case may be, the proponents of treason won the day. Replying to Vice Admiral Hood, the General Committee made the fateful decision. Louis XVII was declared the king. Determined not to submit to the tyranny of a convention which has sworn the ruin of the nation, the people of Toulon, like those of Marseille, prefer to have some recourse to the generosity of a loyal people who have shown the desire to protect the true French against the anarchists who want to destroy them, declares to Admiral Hood. 1. The unanimous vow of all the inhabitants of Toulon is to reject a constitution which cannot make them happy, and to adopt monarchical government as organised by the Constituent Assembly of 1789. Consequently, they have proclaimed their legitimate king, Louis XVII, son of Louis XVI, and have sworn to recognise him always as such, and to suffer no more the despotism of the tyrants who govern France today. Having declared in favour of the boy king, the rebels of Toulon had crossed the royalist Rubicon. Divided and desperate, Toulon had renounced the Republic, one and indivisible. However, for all the raucous debate which accompanied this decision, agreement within the sections was only the first hurdle. Stationed between the sections and their British saviours was, of course, the French Mediterranean fleet. Maybe, just maybe, someone should have had a chat to the sailors. Like the town itself, the navy in Toulon was riddled with divisions. Its commanding officer, Rear Admiral Trogoff, supported, at least publicly, the actions of the General Committee. French naval historian Léon Guérin does his best to rehabilitate the Rear Admiral's reputation, depicting Trogoff as a prisoner of the sectionary regime who was merely doing his best to prevent the destruction of the French fleet. Historian Paul Cottard couldn't disagree more. A fellow French historian, Cottard notes the testimony of leading royalists after the Restoration. These claims clearly incriminate Trogoff and state that he was in league with the counter-revolution. Irrelevant of his true loyalties, Trogoff found himself conveniently crippled by a bad case of gout, and was absent from his men when word arrived from shore that the commander favoured surrender. As it turns out, his subordinates did not. Upon hearing the news of the town's alliance with the British, mutinies erupted across the French fleet. The result was days of inaction as negotiations ensued. Faced with both humiliation and treason, the rebellion soon gained structure when Trogoff's second in command, Rear Admiral Saint Julien, proceeded to seize the initiative. Ordering the occupation of two nearby forts, the sailors did so without so much as firing a shot. Losing control of two critical fortifications and the French fleet, Toulon's treason was off to a fantastic start. Somehow, it then managed to get worse. Lining up the ships in a crescent formation, Saint Julien positioned the fleet in a strategic position. On one side, the fleet could obliterate the English if they attempted to enter the harbour. On the other, the town itself was now within range, open to a devastating bombardment should the need occur. For the General Committee of the sections, this was a looming disaster. With the Republic's armies just days away, the fleet had to comply. Unless resolved immediately, the convention would triumph. Short on time, the sectionaries collaborated with Hood to use every trick in the book. In addition to highlighting the brutal reprisals that faced the town, promises were made to reimburse the sailors their unpaid wages in cash. Safe passage was also pledged for those who did not wish to partake in the surrender, and the town was allowed to keep flying the tricolour rather than compelled to adopt the white flag of the monarchy. These measures were enough to cause much division amongst the crews. But perhaps most importantly, the insurrectionary authorities secured the remaining fortifications around Toulon's harbour and fixed their guns on the French fleet. If the crews did not comply, the French would sink their own. Resistance was futile. Thus, through a combination of inducements and threats, the compliance of the French fleet was secured. Some sailors abandoned their posts, refusing to partake in the treason, while most complied with the orders of Admiral Trogoff to withdraw into the inner harbour. With the outer harbour now cleared of hostile vessels, the British and their royalist allies secured the remaining fortifications. With the Spanish fleet having arrived on the scene, the combined Anglo-Spanish fleet proceeded to anchor in Toulon's outer harbour. By the end of the 29th of August, the town and all its fortifications were in Allied hands. Yet, as odd as this may sound, the town's surrender was actually the easy part. Keeping Toulon, well, that was where Hood's optimism would be put to the test. Almost immediately, the British found themselves in action against Republican forces. To back up a bit, when the French fleet accepted the futility of resistance, many committed Republicans sought to escape. Literally jumping from their vessels and swimming to shore, the town's authorities made no attempt to stop them. After all, sailors without ships were hardly a threat. Overcrowded prisons, however, now that was a problem. As such, hundreds of French sailors started to make their way to Marseille, running right into the Convention's forces. With the French alerted to the treason of Toulon, the Republic's troops advanced. At this point, the forces available to the French were under the command of Jean-Francois Carteau. Described by Napoleon as an ignorant amateur, Carteau is perhaps one of the more infamous characters of the Siege of Toulon. Aged 42 at the time of the campaign, Carteau had once been a dragoon in the Royalist army in the 1770s. Retiring to pursue a career as a painter, he had been a private citizen for a decade before re enlisting in 1789. Historians are almost obliged to point out that it was as a painter that Cortot painted a portrait of King Louis XVI. And it's actually pretty good. I've put links in the show notes and on social media for those interested. Despite his apt portrayal of the king, Cartot was a committed revolutionary, and he was subsequently promoted more for his loyalty than his competence. Stationed with the Army of the Alps when the Federalist Revolts erupted, by sheer coincidence, the officer found himself in a strategic location. Garrisoned on the road between Lyon and Marseille, it was Cartot which obstructed cooperation between the two insurrectionary cities. With other elements of the Army of the Alps moving against Lyon, Cartot was tasked with marching south. For all the criticisms levelled against him, he achieved undeniable success. Commanding a small force of perhaps just 5,000 men, the Republic's forces recaptured Avignon and then subdued Marseille. It was the imminent arrival of Cartot which had triggered Toulon's treason. Seeking to secure his triumph of southern France, Cartot moved against Toulon within days of Marseille's occupation. On the 30th of August, Cartot's vanguard secured the town of Orlu, roughly 4 miles or 7 kilometers to the west of Toulon. Orlu was a strategic location for both sides. Located on the main road between Marseille and Toulon, Orlu also sat in a narrow mountain pass. This gorge provided a natural choke point, one with numerous advantages. If the French could seize it, the Allies would be trapped, hemmed into a small strip of land thanks to the mountainous terrain which surrounded Toulon. For the defenders, controlling the gorge would mitigate French numerical supremacy and provide some much needed breathing space between the enemy and the harbour. Furthermore, containing the key road to Marseille and beyond, it was from Orlu that offensive operations could be launched. Now, it's at this point that you may wonder why such a strategic position was seized 5 days after the conquest of Marseille. Surely this should have been done sooner, especially given the close proximity of Marseille to Orlu. Well, for some scholars, this tardiness is grounds for justified criticism of Cortot's lackluster leadership. But for others, this delay was understandable, given what Cartot was working with. After all, the convention's forces were essentially operating in hostile territory, and the Republicans had little to no information about the enemy. Caution was perhaps a reasonable response for a relatively modest force comprised of mainly inexperienced volunteers who could soon find themselves engaged with a large professional army. Whatever the case, the French occupied Orlu on the morning of the 30th of August with a vanguard of perhaps 600 to 800 men, or roughly 15% of Cortot's force. Having secured the town, Cartot immediately ordered his vanguard to advance, hoping to seize the strategic village of La Seine. The settlement rested on the shores of Toulon's inner harbour, on the opposite side of Toulon itself. If secured, the French could perhaps make contact with the convention's supporters. Between the French crews which remained in Toulon, as well as those citizens outraged by the embrace of the enemy, it was possible that a coordinated rebellion could provide opportunity. Furthermore, from La Seine, one could secure neighbouring heights and fortifications, offering a key vantage point from which to control the harbour. But, unfortunately for the French, the strategic importance of Orlu, La Seine, and the surrounding terrain was not lost on the Allies. Hastily assembling a force of about 600 men, British Captain Elphinstone led a mixture of British and Spanish troops on a well-renowned sortie. Through manoeuvres that even French historians concede as skillful, the Allies pushed the French back, forcing a retreat from the important choke point of Orleans. However, although the coalition of Anglo-Spanish forces had performed well, this first battle proved a poor omen nonetheless. In departing Toulon, the British captain had requested support from the General Committee of the sections. The Royalists, which the rebels now officially were, did provide the requested men and cannon. But the help came late, missing the fight completely. This was just the first of many frictions between the coalition powers and their local allies. Mistrust and suspicion soon crippled effective cooperation. Not helping the matter was the performance of French royalists just a week later. On the 7th of September, Cortot renewed his efforts to seize Orleans. Garrisoned by the Royalist National Guard, the critical location was lost to the enemy. The events surrounding this engagement are controversial. French historians, even those critical of the insurrection, generally praise the performance of the Royalist militia. Historian Paul Cottard, for example, proclaims a historic resistance. In such tribute, Cottard is far from alone, and the story goes that these 400 defenders held the line until all their ammunition was spent. Spanish and English sources are less complimentary. One British officer reported that Royalist guardsmen fled their posts, leaving a small contingent of Spaniards to an unfortunate end. Irrelevant of the exact circumstances, on the 7th of September, the result was the same. Orleans was lost. For the French Republic, this was an important victory. Now denying the Allies much-needed manoeuvrability on their western flank, other French forces completed the encirclement by securing positions on the town's eastern perimeter. With Montferrand preventing operations being launched directly north, the Allies were essentially trapped. Yet, in these small engagements, which christened the campaign for Toulon, fate would play a critical part. Although no one could know it, the ramifications of the seizure of Orleans would shape the course of history. In the battle on the 7th, a French captain named Bonaparte was seriously wounded. Bonaparte was the commanding officer of Cortot's artillery. His loss was a major blow. If only there was a capable and energetic officer, one skilled in the art of artillery, who could come and save the day. The French needed a hero. They got an emperor. Thank you for listening to episode 71, Toulon, Terror or Treason. In the next episode, we witness Napoleon's triumph. Need I say more? Before you go, I have a question for you. Did you enjoy this episode? Did you find it entertaining? Did you find it educational? Because if you did, then I need your help to do it again. Grey History is only possible thanks to the amazing people doing their part to keep this podcast on the air. With bonus episodes, ad-free listening, and a range of other perks, help produce history that isn't black and white, and help ensure that there's more Grey History waiting for you tomorrow. Without your help, well, this podcast could very easily be crushed by the counter-revolution. There's links in the show notes and on the website, as well as the new Apple Podcast subscription. Those on the True Revolutionary tier can already enjoy early access to episode 72, Napoleon's Triumph. Finally, between now and the next episode, please find the chance to recommend the show to friends or family. Word of mouth remains the key way for people to discover independent podcasts, so if you see the opportunity, please seize it for the glory of the Republic. One final welcome to the newest members of the community, and a special shout out again to the heroically generous Heroes of the Revolution, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Borger, Kevin, Scott, Howard, Fernando, and Hilberto. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. Stay safe and have a great day.